All right, it's been a while. I'm joined again by Zion. My name's Jeff. I'm INTJ. We're going to jump right into it. We're going to look at the birth chart of Jenna Ortega and kind of see if we can decipher which type she is. I'm leaning more towards INTJ, but I guess we'll take a look here. Go ahead and take it away, Zion.
All right. So Jenna Ortega's birth chart, we couldn't necessarily obtain an accurate birth time for her, so we don't know what houses are where in her chart. So we decided to just go with the chart without the houses and get a more general feel for her. But one of the things that jumps out right off the bat is this big green triangle. And usually, when you have a big triangle like this, called a grand trine, it signifies a really important relationship between different points. And in this case, it's Neptune, the moon, and of all things, her sun, and also Mercury on top of her sun, right over here. So what does that mean? Basically, Neptune is your ability to sort of emotionally morph and change yourself to take on the essence of others. Neptune is a spiritual planet, and it is an emotionally receptive planet. And so, where you see Neptune, you see sort of an ability to change and become almost anything. You're sort of an empty vessel, an empty container, and you can take on the essence of others. Spoiler alert, Neptune and Pisces in the 12th house that relate to it are all implicated in acting because it allows you to become someone else. And so her Neptune being so strongly in a trine relationship to her sun and moon at the same time indicates a really strong acting ability because she can kind of just emotionally take on the persona of anyone and anything at any time. She has apparently a very strong ability to do that. All three of these different things in this green triangle, the Neptune, the moon, the sun, and also the Mercury along with the sun, since they're right on top of each other, they're all in air signs. What does that mean? It means that she's very good at using that sort of planetary relationship to communicate. She can communicate along many different lines all at once. She has probably a fairly advanced and sophisticated thought process that goes into what she does. And so she's able to not only take her ego and wrap it up into these emotional roles with Neptune and the moon, but she's able to communicate them very directly to people. That's the first big thing that jumps out.
All right, so like you said, kind of like mimicking other people and being able to take on roles. I did kind of an informal typing session on my Discord server. I'm thinking about redoing it and recording it with some people. It's kind of like a group thing. It was kind of interesting. It was definitely a lot of SE in there, so it does kind of pop up of SE to me.
Yeah. Um, yeah, SE, I mean, SE as a function is sort of hard to tie to astrology stuff because it could be all kinds of different things that are bringing that out, all kinds of different combinations. But
Yeah.
when you see the sun and the moon being in a really strong relationship to each other in a chart, you see someone with a relatively powerful personality and presence. But since it's also tied to Neptune, this is a very like adaptable and very sort of like self-aware person.
Hmm.
And the fact that Mercury is right on top of the sun also means that she, once again, is very good at communicating and thinking directly, probably because with your ego tied up in your ability to think and communicate, it's like there's no separation between your sense of expressing yourself and your words. So there's a very powerful expression mechanism, you could say.
Okay, yeah, because we're trying to compare and contrast stuff. We don't have our accurate birth time, so we don't have the houses. So that's kind of there are birth charts with her houses in it, but we just don't know how accurate they are. So that's kind of like a third of the story is out, right? Like, I mean, a big chunk of the picture's missing.
It might be, yeah. I mean, it kind of depends. Obviously, the houses are sort of the areas of life, the behaviors of the things that you see all the stuff cropping up in. I also usually talk about the houses as being like an identity for a planet in a sense. So, like, you've got the sign, which is like the way that the planet is characterized, the personality that drives, and then the house is kind of like the identity or role that they take on. So, if it's in the first house, for instance, it might be like they're a sort of like warrior figure, or they're some sort of originator or entrepreneur or something like that. So we only have the personalities, quote unquote, since we only have the signs, but that's still pretty good. And so then people are like, well, why is she playing Wednesday? She has like a Libra sun sign. That doesn't make sense. Libras are just like these nice people persons. And it's
Mhm.
like, well, because there's a lot more going on is the answer. So if you look over here, we have this lovely Venus in Scorpio, and Venus in Scorpio would indicate a relating style and a sort of material sense of self that is very dark. When I say material sense of self, I'm not necessarily talking about who you are, I'm talking about what you are. Venus kind of pulls double duty because it relates to Libra and to Taurus. And since we just talked about her sun being in Libra, you can kind of surmise that they're connected, and they are, because that means that Venus in Scorpio is the ruler of the sun. And Venus is in the sign of darkness and extreme emotions. So we've already described how she's kind of a shapeshifter and she can do a lot of character acting. She has a relatively direct way of communicating her sense of personal expression. But since the ruler of her sun and her Mercury down here are in Scorpio rather, it kind of gives that personal expressiveness an aim towards intensity, an aim towards a dark persona. So what you tend to see coming out in her, what she kind of tends to become, is this like dark character. So it's really interesting that she ended up playing Wednesday because it seems like that's actually very fitting.
Yeah, one of the interviews she was saying, she was talking about how she does kind of like dark roles and she's drawn to it. I guess I'm not big into movies and fiction and stuff, but she was in the new Scream movie, so that's kind of a dark thing. And she always dreamed of working with Tim Burton, who makes all these weird dark movies as well.
Yeah. Well, and if we want to tie it into the idea that she's an INTJ, if introverted intuition is her lead function, then a Venus in Scorpio is actually a pretty good indication of that function because it indicates your relating style. And if your relating style is something that is simultaneously very private but also very intense when it expresses itself, and if it's sort of esoteric and arcane and creative and analytical, which Scorpio is, then you can kind of see how she's putting her ego here in Libra forward in this dark relational position with Scorpio, which kind of really looks like an NI kind of combination to me, at least.
Okay, and I think it's past the cusp actually, since it's Virgo going into Libra, so she isn't born on a cusp, right?
Yeah, no, you can see these two little marks here.
Yeah.
Those are squarely in Libra. If it was even just like 1/10 of a degree over the line into Libra, it would still solidly be a Libra position. So this is a definite Libra position for these two, and it's a strong one because it's early on in the sign.
Why is it that when you cross over from one to the other, like if you're crossing into another, it could be a cusp, like down here, right? Is the Gemini Cancer? That's a cusp, right?
Uh-huh.
So why is that when it's going from one to the other, but not leaving from one to the other?
Because everything has to have a place where it starts.
Okay.
So when we're talking about like, if it was like right here in Cancer, that's like, well, that's the start of Cancer. Everything has to have a beginning. This is a cycle. It goes from Aries around, and then it goes from Libra all the way back around. And Libra is like the sunset, and Aries is like the dawn. So all these things have a sort of cyclical meaning built into them, which means that everything has to have a place where it starts. This is the start of Taurus, and then this is the start of Gemini.
She's like me, and I guess a lot of people. There's a big gap with the Pisces, Aries, and Taurus. Does that mean anything or
Well, sort of not. See, here's an interesting point that a lot of people will make. Everybody has every sign and house in their charts.
hmm
Just because you don't have anything in Pisces or just because you don't have anything in the seventh house doesn't mean that those things aren't in your chart. It just means that there's nothing there to really express themselves in those places. So you're not going to see it turn up very much. Most people are going to have, I mean, because there's only like what, how many planets? 10, right? Quote unquote planets, including the moon and the sun, which are also called luminaries. And even if you count the asteroids, in a lot of cases, there's going to be some kind of gap in people's charts. So there's always going to be a place where they're not expressing something, or it doesn't come out in them as a characteristic that you see very often. It doesn't mean it's not there. Everybody has everything. It's just that there's a lot of emphasis put on certain things for certain people in different combinations.
I know my Chiron is kind of dark. What does her Chiron say about her? It's listed in here, right? The little key symbol by
Yeah, a little
Capricorn.
key symbol. It's right at the top at the start of Capricorn. Yeah, that Chiron. If you buy into asteroids, not everybody does. I mean, I think of them as minor things, but Chiron is considered the place where you're trying to learn how to heal things, and how you kind of relate to the healing process, which involves regeneration and darker themes, but also involves Sagittarian themes of trying to learn how to embrace the higher truth of life so that you can reconstitute yourself, sort of an idea. Because Chiron was a centaur in Greek mythology, and the centaur is obviously a Sagittarian thing, but we're talking about healing. We're also talking about Virgo and Scorpio and other things. Chiron is your relationship to healing your own sort of wounds, but also helping others heal theirs. It could be psychological, it could be also a physical illness. And so Chiron is almost like where you're trying to play doctor in a way. If it's in
Mhm.
Capricorn, it takes on a very serious tone. Capricorn is a sign of reality. Capricorn is a sign of the outer world and trying to deal with how reality actually works. And so if Chiron is there, then your approach to healing is a very sober and serious one. If you see people in distress, you treat it with a lot of seriousness. You approach it as if it's something that you need to fix and work on yourself over a long period of time and to be very dedicated to.
I know we were talking a little bit before this, and some of the interviews I did watch, she has like a little bit of a social justice warrior mentality, but that could be due to her age and generation. She was saying
Yeah.
like how Latinos are underrepresented, even though she's playing a Latino family that's traditionally.
Yeah, that's weird. Well, yeah, it could just be her age and her generation. Who knows? I mean, later on in life, she'll just be like, oh man, that was so stupid when I did that when I was in my 20s or whatever. But um, with Chiron and Capricorn, she at least tries to treat whatever social crusade she's on as a serious attempt to heal other people in the world. So she's at least probably doing it unironically, you know?
Hmm.
She's not being superficial about it necessarily. When you see, but like once again, we come back to this big green triangle. Not everybody has a big green triangle in their charts. It's actually a pretty powerful thing. Um, this big green triangle shows that her sun is tied up with Neptune up here in Aquarius and the moon down in Gemini. And Neptune and the moon are emotional planets or luminaries, whichever. And if your sun is so strongly in aspect to those things and such strong agreement with them, it means that you have a sort of emotional and cosmic view of life in the universe in terms of like your own consciousness and the way that you express yourself. Uh, and she might over identify in some ways with the universal suffering of others in Neptune. Because remember, I said Neptune is good at like helping you suck up personas and like imitate people. Well,
Hmm.
it's also the planet of empathy because of that. You are so sensitive to other personalities and what they're experiencing and what they've gone through and what their perspectives look like that you have a lot of empathy for them, but there's no off switch. And so when you have a strong aspect between the sun and Neptune, you're going to have a lot of automatic empathy for other people. And in this case, she probably is pretty good at expressing it. Not everybody is, but she seems to be good at directly expressing it. So I think that the social justice thing is a pretty easy fit for her. We'll see if she changes her mind later about how it actually works, though, because that Chiron and Capricorn that we were just talking about is striving to learn the actual rules and limits of caring and compassion and healing, right? So, and then of course the moon just makes it even stronger because the moon is also an empathic body. It's just more the direct interpersonal, like emotional caring, like familial relationships, like close friendships, kind of a thing. But since they're all in agreement, and that's another thing that we had to mention, they're all in agreement. They're not in disagreement. This big green triangle represents that they all get along. They're all in harmony. But what that means is that they also don't necessarily learn many strong or stiff lessons about what they should and shouldn't be doing with that strong harmony that they're all in. So her son has this cosmic empathy and this like interpersonal emotional connectedness and stuff, like going strong with it. But she may not really realize how strong those things are in her, and she may not really understand the ins and outs or whether or not it's always practical or realistic to be so empathically connected to others, to be on such a crusade for other people's needs. So over time, she's probably going to start to realize it's not all it's cracked up to be. It just seems like a really strong drive for her right now because she hasn't had the experience to see otherwise. So
Yeah, we got to keep in mind she's only like 20 or 21. She's young.
yeah,
So
yeah,
just kind of
exactly.
wrap up the social justice warrior agenda in a nutshell. Like we're doing this, but we really don't have a practical reason why we're doing this, it seems.
Yeah, kind of. It's kind of just this automatic reaction. She has a
Yeah.
very strong ability to react that way, right? But she doesn't necessarily always know why she's doing it, or even if it's a good idea. Also, there's a lot of stuff in astrology that like officially takes 20, 40, 60 years, like they say that until your first nodal return, which happens in mid to late 30s, you really aren't even advancing very far on your evolutionary path at all. And it just takes that much time. There's nothing you can do about it. So there are things in astrology that just take time. So you have to be allowed the time to sort of learn and make your own mistakes and things like that. And it just is what it is. You can't push it any faster.
Yeah, that's interesting. She has her, I don't know what house it's in, but her moon and her north node is in Gemini like mine.
Yep. And her moon is actually conjunct, I would say, conjunct her north node. Yours isn't, but still close.
Yeah.
And that might actually be a very INTJ kind of thing. Gemini is a sign of thought and communication, but it's different from Aquarius and Libra in that it has sort of a dark side to it. You could say that Aquarius and Libra have a dark side to them, but not exactly. Gemini is a little bit unique amongst the air signs because it has a dark side to it. Gemini is the sign of masks and putting on different faces for different people in social contexts. It's also very sort of flaky and flighty for that reason. But if you're North Node's in Gemini, it's probably going to be a more positive expression where you're just a really good community organizer and friend and people person. And like you're a very strong thinker, always analyzing all the data you're encountering all the time, really sifting through all the data that's incoming from the outside world. And so, but if you have a North Node in Gemini, despite the fact that that makes the Gemini interpretation more positive, it also means that it's a blind spot that you need to develop. And so that would also mean that the corresponding South Node would be over here in Sagittarius. Where would it be? Fairly early in the sign, like right about there, right? It doesn't show it on this chart, but that's where her South Node would be, which is very close to what's this planet?
Pluto,
Yeah. And what does Pluto rule? What sign?
Scorpio, right?
Yep, which means that this Venus is ruled by Pluto, and Venus is the ruler of the sun and Mercury here. Oh, and then of course this Pluto is ruled in turn by Jupiter down here in Leo, which is then ruled by the sun. So there's a giant cycle here. They just all go in a big circle. That's what we call a mutual reception. There's no final ruler in the chart. Oftentimes we can build a tree of the rulership. So it's like a flow chart sort of thing. But in this case, it's just a giant circle.
Hmm.
And when you have a giant circle like that, it means that there's kind of no real final goal. It's just like things are all kind of combining and swirling around endlessly in an infinite loop. But so Pluto being on top of her south node, once again, kind of gives her it kind of infuses her with darkness, so to speak. I mean, we don't want to sound too dramatic, but Pluto and Scorpio are literally the embodiment of drama. So, whatever. If you have Pluto on the south node, then you probably have an overweening tendency, too much of a tendency to express the dark side, to always be looking for these sort of mystical or arcane secrets of life. You exude darkness everywhere you go and everything you do. And you're also really good at showing intense emotion when you want to summon it. So that might be again part of her ability to act. I saw some of the earlier clips from other shows and stuff that she did, other roles that she was in, and she was doing some horror stuff. She was acting as like some little kid in some like Disney show, right?
Mhm.
And in both of those cases, she was showing some really intense emotional range in her expression. So I think that that might be part of it.
She did seem to have a lot of FI. I mean, if she is an INTJ, I mean, women are more conditioned to be more emotional. Do you see, and some INTJs just prefer to use their FI over their TE, especially when they're younger, I think.
Yeah.
You kind of see any inkling of that, rather wish you'd use a FI rather than TE?
As far as TE, I don't know that I'm seeing a huge amount in this chart. That might come in more at the houses, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But something that's interesting, well, we'll finish with the nodes first and then come back to this part. But FI definitely, in terms of like this stuff right here, the south node with Pluto and Scorpio Venus that rules the sun, like that's just like an unbelievably FI kind of a thing. Scorpio is known for being a very secretive, very intensive emotional sign. It's one of the water signs, but
Mhm.
it's a lot less outgoing in a lot of cases about it than the other two water signs are, which themselves are also kind of already private and hidden as well, because that's just a water thing. But Scorpio is the most intensively private. And so when you have like really intense Pluto position with the South Node, and you have a really intense like Scorpio Venus that rules the sun and stuff, you kind of get the feeling that it's not just FI somewhere in the function stack, but perhaps rather FI buried really deep that then kind of comes out. You know, Scorpio has this emotional issue or trait of erupting and exploding, building pressure. So which she apparently manages consciously. Like she will apparently build up her emotions and then let them explode in order to do her acting kind of a thing, probably something like that.
Yeah, I don't really think she talked much about her methodology. I know on the Discord chat we had, we were kind of everybody thought she was initially an ENTJ. I seen INFP as a potential type for her too, but I think that's just out of the question.
No, no.
Yeah, definitely a lot of
The
SE and IFITE.
having watched her interviews and having watched some of her other acting roles, I really get an INTJ vibe off of her. I really don't think she's an ENTJ unless something funny is going on.
Okay, so there's
Um,
nothing in her chart that would indicate ENTJ, like you said, not a lot of TE strong presence. I think my Jupiter in Capricorn. I was reading about that. I forgot which house off the top of my head, but that seemed pretty TE.
yeah, Jupiter Capricorn. Well, we'd have to look at your chart again, but usually with INTJs, you see some fairly, uh, for lack of a better term, mystical placements. I mean, NI is not just like the super genius, like I'm a computer engineer kind of a placement. It can be, but even more than that, I feel like NI has a very sort of mystical component to it where it is trying to take a lot of disparate information from the imagination and even from a sense of spirituality, which people shy away from because they don't want to talk about things in terms of spirituality. But I think that NI is actually a fairly spiritual function in some ways because it is a very cosmic, visionary sort of thing.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, and we don't know what her rising sign is because we don't have the houses, but with her nodes, we can see that she's trying to move away from expressing her darkness because that's something that's actually too easy for her to do, and it's actually probably going to become destructive. Another problem with Pluto and Scorpio is that they are very, very self-destructive. By their very nature, they are meant to destroy you and force you to become something new. And not only that, but they're there to force you to do it over and over and over again endlessly. It's an endless cycle. All the water signs involve cycles. And so she has to kind of escape this incessant dark cycle of burning herself down to cinders and then reconstituting herself. Because even though it's serving her well now, it may not forever. She might at some point have a breakdown. She might have a crazy addiction. She might get into some kind of like legal trouble. Something crazy might happen. Let's hope not. But With the North Node being in Gemini, with the Moon conjunct it, opposing this whole thing. And by the way, since the South Node is in Sagittarius, she has a problem with shooting her mouth off and having opinions, too many opinions, too many strong opinions, and just kind of ignoring everyone else and thinking that she always knows what's right and what's best, kind of a thing.
Yeah, I know the feeling there.
So it's not just a Pluto conjunct the South Node, it's a Pluto in Sagittarius with a strong sense of self righteousness, which is an interesting and potentially very bad combination.
Yeah, I was about to ask what are like some of her squares or some stuff that's kind of working against her besides, I guess, that.
No, don't worry, we're getting there. It's just taking forever because there's so much going on. The North Node is something we have to touch on before we move to the squares. So the North Node, being so close to that moon that has the trine aspect to the sun and the trine aspect to Jupiter, like that North Node shows that her ability to take on personas or to empathize with people, and also whatever her sense of ego may be, since it's in Libra, it's a sort of a thinking interpersonal kind of ego. But those are aiding her personal development to some extent. She's trying to become more immediately empathic towards people rather than thinking that she's like a cosmic know-it-all. That's what I would read from this combination of nodes and the planets that are next to them. And she has to develop her ability to really interface with people in a more immediate sense. So we don't know what she's like in her personal life. We only see what she's doing in her roles as an actress, right? But I would wager that she is one of these INTJs that is really good at certain things like acting,
Hmm.
but she's not able to necessarily interact with people the way that she really needs to. And it might really start to eat away at her and cause a lot of internal issues.
Yeah, I mean, she's groomed from real little to be social and this, and I guess it just kind of goes against her ego, if you will.
We talked a little bit about her nodes. It also means she's going to have to think about what she's saying. She's using this Sagittarius South node with Pluto to evoke really strong, direct personal expression. And she can't necessarily do that forever. It's not necessarily a good idea to keep doing that because it's like all she's relying on. And eventually it's going to break down. She needs to figure out how to speak correctly, think correctly, and actually interface with people in a more sort of personalized way rather than just shooting her mouth off and just having like these emotional explosions.
Yeah, I was reading like accounts from her, and a lot of people say that she's really rude in private and
Oh,
uh,
really? Well, that's funny because that's exactly what I just said here. That's exactly what this is in Sagittarius Pluto with the South Node. That's like to a T. This would be the South Node. What is that? The upside down headphone thing. I can't really
yeah.
draw it, but yeah, no, that's exactly what it is. So she is doing well on the screen as an actress. Yeah, there you go. She's doing well in that capacity, but she may not really be doing well with any people in her actual life, which will start to undermine her probably pretty badly at some point. So,
Yeah,
and
I think
and
she's
she
gonna
probably
hit.
just doesn't think before she talks. She probably just doesn't think before she shoots her mouth off.
Yeah, yeah. That's my problem. I know in life, when I do say something, I don't say something much in real person, but it's usually negative or very critical.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Opinionated, critical, biting. Another thing about Pluto and Scorpio is that they're analytically creative, and so they are always criticizing and deconstructing everything and everybody in a way that seems kind of invasive. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So being in Sagittarius means that she's also going to be really obvious about it. You
we
can
can
see
only
these
do.
red lines are like the squares. This one here, this one here. There's another one there that's like a little bit less of a strong aspect. You can see when like they're like lighter colored and thinner that they're not as strongly aspected because it's like not as close in terms of the measurements. Like this is the middle of Sagittarius, this is a little bit later in Virgo. But in terms of the squares, like something that's really because we said that this Venus is ruled over by Pluto, which is ruled over by Jupiter. But the problem here is that this Venus and this Jupiter are in a square to each other because they're both in fixed signs. Scorpio and Leo tend to clash because they're both fixed signs. What does it mean? Well, this cycle that I was talking about of these rulers all ruling each other, it just kind of endlessly goes around like a merry-go-round. If you've got some of these things in a square relationship to each other, not only is it a merry-go-round where they all kind of combine their energy, it also creates a lot of internal pressure. There's an internal conflict and clash for the person. So the Venus and the Jupiter being in a conflict with one another kind of tends to indicate that her relating style and her sense of over enthusiastic self righteousness are something that create an internal conflict for her. She's not just shooting her mouth off and criticizing other people and being rude. She also has this like really strong internal conflict going on between these two planets, you know?
Hmm.
Um, and when your sense of personal philosophy and your sense of higher self is in conflict with your ability to relate, or your conflict, a conflict with what you sense you are, which is what Venus represents, then you're struggling all the time to figure out what you are. You know, how do you conceive of goals to chase after, and how do you know who or what you actually are when those two things are constantly fighting? And so she probably has this sense inside that she can't really figure out who she is. And so it's not just that she's critical and rude towards other people. She's also probably really torn up inside all the time. She might be self-critical, but even more likely, she just can't figure out who she's supposed to be. And so, since we have this strong aspect with the sun and Neptune and the moon here in this big green triangle that I was talking about earlier, her ability to take on other people's emotions and personas might actually be, in some ways, kind of devouring her from the inside because she can't even figure out what she is. And that's not necessarily a good combination, right? Saturn returns indicate like your ability to mature over this different cycles of your life. Saturn's a really interesting planet that I think gets too overlooked. And here's a really interesting hint about synastry and relationship charts. Saturn is really important between people for marriage because it indicates their ability to build something together long term and to be realistic with each other and maintain the relationship. But Saturn is the planet that like kind of like Pluto. I mean, Pluto is more exciting, but people really hate Saturn. Pluto and Saturn are the big villains, just like Scorpio and Capricorn are. But Saturn, the reason that people don't like it is that it is the planet of rules and limits, and nobody likes rules and limits.
Hmm. Unless you're an SJ.
Yeah, some people might like them. They have a healthy relationship with their Saturn. Saturn in this chart doesn't look like it's interacting too strongly with a lot of stuff, but it is kind of, let's see. Yeah, no, it's in a trine relationship with Uranus here. But Saturn in the chart indicates how you kind of interface with reality, your ability to understand reality and work with it, and your ability to create something in life. So Saturn's a very goal-oriented planet. And you're like, well, it has to do with rules and limits. Why does it have to do with goals and achieving things too? It's like, well, because in order to achieve things and create your goals in life, you have to be able to work with rules and limits. So Saturn isn't just the planet that says no all the time, although it does do that. It's also the planet that enables you to manifest things in reality. And all of a sudden it becomes a lot more exciting, right?
Hmm.
No, it's like rules and limits, wherever you're expressing your ability to interface with rules and limits in Saturn, is also where you're kind of able to manifest your goals and the things that you want in reality because you're able to physically constitute them into some kind of shell or into some kind of plan or system. So she doesn't really have a strong Saturn in terms of its aspects to other things. It's in a trine aspect to her Uranus and Aquarius, which means that, her ability to innovate herself and to get along with other people is really strong in terms of her ability to manifest her goals, let's say. Yeah, thanks, Zoom. I got it. Do I have to click I got it every time? Okay. All right. So we want to talk about the rulers of the nodes, huh?
Yeah, we'll go there. Hopefully, I don't hear
We'll
that dog
go
in the
there.
background.
All right. Okay. So Gemini North Node means ruler is Mercury, which is this thing right next to the sun. Let's see. Sagittarius South Node is right here or thereabouts. And so that means that the ruler is Jupiter right down here. Okay. So the rulers of the nodes are really important for indicating how the nodes tend to play out and like what you tend to do with them or what the aim of the node is. It sounds kind of weird, but like if you think about the south node here as being sort of like where you're really overdeveloped and where you have a lot of really good and bad tendencies that tend to just be magnified too much. And there's no balance here. There's just you're so overdeveloped here that there's no balance at all. And it becomes you can be really good at stuff in the south node, but by the same token, it can also pretty much unravel you if you're not careful. And the north node is where you're not as good at things and what you really badly need to develop. It forms the evolutionary path, you know. Let's make a big arrow. This is the evolutionary path for her. And so if we think about the rulers of either side of that evolutionary path as being really important to illustrating how those two sides of the evolutionary path are actually working, then we get a much bigger picture about how the person themselves it was working. So uh South Node ruler Jupiter Leo, that she has a very, very, very inflated opinion of herself, like an unbelievably like strong, not necessarily ego, because Jupiter's not your ego, your sun is your ego. But Jupiter is where you're very optimistic and overenthusiastic because it represents your higher self. So if you think about the fire signs and the fire planets in like three stages, kind of like the water ones, Mars is like, you know, Mars and Aries are your ability to act instinctively. It's like your instinct, your basic sense of consciousness. Leo and the Sun are like your ego and your ability to understand yourself and express yourself and like kind of focus on yourself. You could say focus on yourself. And then the third fire theme is Sagittarius and Jupiter, and that is your ability to reach for a higher self and expand yourself outward and draw new things into yourself that are right for you. So it ends up looking extremely selfish because you've got the planet of the higher self and expansion, you know, in the sign of the ego and self-awareness and self-entertainment and self-focus. She could be a very warm person when she wants to be, you know, but with the South Node Sagittarius with Pluto on top of it, and the fact that she's taking on these darker roles and trying to exude really strong emotions, is driving towards a position that is very egotistical, where she thinks that she's like this higher being who is particularly important unto herself. So her success in acting, there's a real danger, you know, in expressing these like really strong direct emotions in acting. In some ways, there's a huge danger of her becoming massively overinflated in terms of her enthusiasm about what she thinks she can accomplish. And in having too strong a sense of self and getting her ego to like expand way too large.
Uh,
So, I mean, this kind of sounds like an INTJ because INTJs often will say that they regret early in life not reining themselves in. They
mhm.
felt they felt too strong a sense of personal importance, and it was like I'm the cosmic master of everything, you know. Um, and they'll also express things like, I wish that I had gotten along with people better. I wish that I had. What does this sound like? I wish I had talked to them more. I wish I had treated relationships more seriously. What is this? What is this? This is the North Node here in Gemini. And also, since the moon is right next to it, that involves a lot of emotional surface communication with those people too, you know. So her South Node and its ruler are all about self-aggrandizement and constantly biting off maybe more than she can chew and trying to kind of like she might start aiming for things that she just can't accomplish, and eventually it might end up crushing her. But we'll see. Um,
Yeah,
and
we're
that rudeness
very
towards people goes right along with that because she kind of thinks too much of herself. Anyway, go ahead.
so yeah, we're very egocentric having an I hero, I think. We kind of forget
Yeah,
there's other people existing in the universe.
which you know that's fine. We need people in the universe who are egocentric to some extent. Like it serves its purpose, but it can obviously get out of control. All these things have good and bad expressions. So her evolutionary path is to go down here to Gemini, and if it really is indeed in the eighth house, like we think it might be, then that, like yours, turns into not only socializing and connecting more with people, but also becomes kind of almost like what I would describe as the ultimate analyst position because Gemini is intellectually analytical about information. And then the eighth house is the house of creative, like deconstruction and critical analysis kind of a thing. So it could be a very analytical position. It's also a very interpersonal position because it's very interactive. You know, Gemini is interactive. The eighth house is intimacy and closeness. And now, if the ruler for Gemini, the Gemini North Node, is this Mercury right on top of the Sun in Libra, then that's an even stronger reinforcement of the idea that she needs to become more interpersonally polite, more interpersonally communicative, and to tolerate relating to people better. You got two air signs involved with her north node. The moon's on top of the north node, and her sun's on top of the ruler of the north node. So, um, if she could just learn to actually, if she could bring herself to think through what she's saying and actually try to relate to people and form relationships with others, even if it has to be close relationships and not necessarily being a social butterfly, but even just forming a few close relationships. And we already talked about this in terms of your chart, then it's like you can suddenly take the ego a little bit more out of the equation and make things a little bit more healthy and balanced. She has to learn to think. She has to learn to be more considerate, not just to people, but also situations like life in general. She has to be more considerate of everything. Consideration is a skill that she needs to learn. Consider ideas, consider people, consider options, you know? And then, since her son's right on top of that ruler of the North Node, she would actually be able to much better express her ego. Ironically, you know, like she has this South Node and this Jupiter that are like way overinflated in their sense of personal importance and like what they can accomplish and everything. Ironically, if she would just learn to interact with people a little bit better and think things through more intricately, use her intellect, use her frontal lobe in her brain, then her ego would find a much better way to be served and express itself. And then she would, ironically, feel much more important, right? So, but she has to be able to communicate and interact more before she can feel more importance. And so at some point, this is going to be a big conflict for her if it isn't already.
Yeah, I was going to say like Virgo is kind of known to be analytical too, right? And Mars is kind of like the way you think and communicate. Isn't that correct?
Mars is your immediate instinct and will to act. So your sense of what you are, you know, the fire signs all have to do with the sense of what you are, right? And also your ability to act upon it. Mars is the most basic one. So basically, what you are is an animal. If you sheared off human consciousness and you couldn't really think straight and you didn't have the ability to do math or speak or anything else, Mars would be your ability to keep acting and fighting and like killing things to survive, you know?
Does it have any
Um,
significance that you see, the Mars?
being in Virgo, oh, it has a very loose square to that Pluto in Sagittarius that is next to the South Node. You can see there's a thin red line compared to the thick red lines, which means it's only a very loose square
Okay.
relationship because they're kind of off center of each other. But um, if Mars is even somewhat in conflict with Pluto, that's going to create a lot of anger because those are the two signs. Well, I shouldn't say signs, those are the two planets of rage. And when they're in conflict with each other, that will create a very strong internal friction where sometimes you'll even be mad that you're mad. You know, it's like that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And different things that set one or the other off will make the other one react badly internally. And so there's a huge like conflict inside. She already has a huge conflict internally, but that's an even bigger one potentially.
Yeah, anger is a pretty big INTJ thing too, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, it's like she has the strong ability to bring out intense emotions, but they're not necessarily always genuine to her or her instincts in the moment because that Mars is in conflict with that Pluto, you know? And so that tends to become this thing where it's like she's trying to express her own sort of real instinctive anger and needs. And it doesn't necessarily come out the way that she's used to doing it. So then people either don't understand it or they misinterpret it, or they don't even see it at all. And that might frustrate her even more. So in some ways, she might feel like her basic needs don't get met or she can't voice them properly, you know? And this is something that we see with people who become famous for acting. They don't always know how to express themselves and what they want and need. And then it's like it keeps going unaddressed forever. And they're always just kind of doing these fake personas and they're just evoking emotions, but it's not really them. And then in their interpersonal lives are just by themselves. They're not really healthy, you know?
And she was a childhood actress, and we all kind of know that they always turn out screwed up most of the time, or a lot of the times at least. You don't really get to live your childhood out, and you're always working, and you really can't learn yourself and express your own needs. Is that anything anywhere in her chart? Maybe like her early childhood?
Early childhood, we usually tie obviously to like Aries and Taurus, Venus and Mars. We'd want to know where the first and second house are, honestly, but she doesn't really have anything in Aries and Taurus. She just has that Venus really prominently positioned. Um, it's hard sometimes to try to determine things about people's like the different parts of their actual lives. You kind of can, when I'm writing about stuff with the first house and Mars and Aries, I'm usually telling people like look at the early part of your childhood and like what you really liked doing and how you liked playing, because as much as Mars and Aries have to do with anger, they also have to do with play because it's kind of like your basic creature self. And I'm like, if you want to know more about your Aries or your Mars or something, and you have like a North Node in Aries, look at what you did really early in life and how you played and like what you liked being, what you liked doing, things like that. Uh, so in some ways, if like we want to characterize Mars as a piece of early childhood, we could do that to some extent, because Mars is one of the things that is going to come out really strongly when you're really young, because it's like your basic impulse to play and fight. But if that's once again in conflict with Pluto, then it's like early on you would have had issues internally with trying to deal with your really intense emotions versus just kind of basically doing what you're supposed to do as a child, which might have created a little bit of a problem for you in terms of how you interact with other people and in terms of how you understand yourself. Now, the thing about square relationships, these big, like ugly red lines, is that they create conflicts, but the conflicts don't necessarily have to be destructive. They can actually be helpful, but it really depends on how much you work on it and how much you embrace it. Um, it's like that line where people are like, it's better to feel something than nothing at all, even if that something is sort of negative. And it's like that's how it is with square relationships and charts. So these red lines don't necessarily mean that it's going to be some kind of like problem or it's going to be really destructive to the person, because they feel it really strongly. There's like this really strong internal conflict in terms of like anger and rage and stuff. And like they don't necessarily know what to do with it. And depending on how they handle it, it could actually be really, really constructive and really drive them forward strongly. So it really, we don't know what she's been doing with that. We can't tell. We don't know how it's gone for her this whole time since she was a kid. We don't know if she's even that aware of it or if she has directly tried to address it with a therapist. We just don't know.
Yeah, like I said before, she doesn't share a lot about her private life, and I guess kind of like when childhood actors usually hit the road is about her age now. So I guess
Yeah,
you
yeah.
tell.
And another thing, I know that, I mean, in my personal experience, I've seen that ENTJs and INTJs often have some like anger issues in terms of like how they express themselves interpersonally. And I've seen INTJs in particular just be really possessed by like inner explosive rage. I don't know if that's something you've seen.
Oh yeah, I definitely experienced that.
Yeah, yeah. My dad was like that. I've seen others do it. So this is kind of an indication of where hers is coming from. Although interestingly, in my chart, I have a three-way square relationship between Pluto, Mars, and the Moon all at once. So, but
Yeah,
are there any other little things that you're curious about here?
I wish we just had an accurate birth time for sure and looked at our houses. That's what I was
Yeah,
thinking. Like if we look at like different birth charts from different websites with our houses, I wonder how consistent they are.
yeah, and I know. And if it really is like what we initially found, then it's literally the same houses as yours, which is really interesting.
Like everything pretty much.
Well, yeah. I mean, so like her south node would be Sagittarius second house, just like yours. Her north node would be
Yeah.
Gemini eighth house, just like yours. So
All right. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap it up for this session. You probably remember my channel, the INTJ equation. I think I'm gonna change directions a little bit. I might make two channels. So I was gonna see where everything goes. We're gonna record some stuff and throw it out there and see what happens, I guess.